Welcome to Flex Perspectives, where I interview the thought leaders, innovators, and executives shaping the future of flexible work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by the Flex Index, the world's most robust source for full-time, hybrid, and remote work requirements. The Flex Index represents more than 6,500 companies, 45,000 office locations, and 100 million people. It's a great place to start if you're looking for your next flexible work career opportunity. Today, my guest is Raj Choudhury. Raj is a professor at Harvard Business School and one of the foremost thinkers on the future of work. He is regularly cited and quoted in leading publications such as The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, CNBC, and NPR. Today, we'll discuss the role of the offsite in building relationships in fully remote companies. Raj will share findings from his latest study, as well as a playbook for how any executive should think through how often, when, where, and why to bring people together in person. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating. That helps new listeners find the podcast. Raj, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Rob, for having me.
So Raj, tell me a little bit about how you got into studying the future of work and the geography of work in the first place.
Yeah, so to cut a long story short, I'm a migration scholar. So I've been studying migration patterns for over a decade. And this includes companies asking people to move both across countries or also within the same country. And then about 7 or 8 years back, I came across the idea of work from anywhere while doing research at the United States Patent Office. And so in this organization, what was happening was the USPTO was allowing back in 2012 its patent examiners to choose where to live. And that was really interesting for me as a migration scholar, because this is instead of the firm telling the worker where to go, the worker was deciding where to go and live. And this would have lots of implications for individuals, for families, for communities, and for the organization. So that's how I got into the work from anywhere theme.
And that organization, I think, has continued to be a standard or kind of an interesting cutting edge organization when it comes to remote work. So that's a pretty fascinating place to start. You focus a lot, as you mentioned, on the geography of work. When you use that term, what exactly does geography of work mean?
So to me, what it means is the location where workers, individuals live. So for me, I've always been excited about work from anywhere, more than just working from home. Because, if you think about work from anywhere conceptually, it is about what I've called geographic flexibility. Instead of the firm telling the worker where to live or from where to move to where, the firm says, you can choose to live wherever you want to live. And then you can work from home, you can work from a co-working space, you can work from a coffee shop, do whatever is convenient to you. But it's about the freedom and the flexibility to choose where to live. And that's something I called work from anywhere.
And is there something personal about that really resonates with you, or what inspired the passion for it? I almost feel the energy in your voice as you talk about why that topic is so interesting.
No, so like I said, given that I've been studying migration patterns for a while, I've documented both the benefits but also the challenges of migration. And when firms think about moving people around, I would say often the challenges are not really well understood or considered. There are significant challenges, both with respect to regulation, licensing of occupations, and the personal and economic costs of moving. So I've studied migrants all over the world, and what really resonated with me was that they often did not have agency or freedom to decide where to live and raise their families. So I'm a migrant myself, so it's of course something I've experienced as well many times in my life. And I think the idea of work from anywhere was very attractive, given all the challenges that I saw migration entailing.
It's funny the way you mention it. In some ways, it feels very American Dream-esque, the way you talk about it, and the idea of the agency you have about where you work and where you live and the flexibility around that. And so I could see the connection between the experience of being a migrant and studying that and why it feels so resonant.
That's correct. Yeah.
So I know you've been cited and I think you're covered all over the place. What are some of the news outlets that you speak with often, or where has your research been highlighted?
So you can find that on the webpage. So it's been, of course, since the COVID pandemic, it's been a topic that people would love to discuss. a lot. So I guess with Nick Bloom, who's also studied this topic for a while, we've been very engaged in sharing our ideas with lots of people.
And it looked like from my first scan, it seems that basically every major media publication, I think, has spoken to you or covered something that you've written over the last few years. So congratulations on all of the important work that you're doing to drive the discourse forward. When you and I spoke recently, you told me that you recently published a research paper on the idea of temporary co-location and the impact of that. What is temporary co-location?
Yeah. So it's not published yet. So it's a working paper, and we're going to send it for peer review soon. Just to back up a little bit. So I think, of course, like many others, I've been thinking about hybrid work, and I've been thinking about what is the right form of hybrid, because I think geographic flexibility and work from anywhere, of course, has lots of benefits, and we can spend the next half an hour talking about those benefits. But I also equally believe that face-to-face, in-person, time with colleagues is also equally important. But I feel that, in many cases, that in-person time does not need to be every week. So for many teams, what they have been doing, self-organizing for years, especially at these all remote companies that I've been studying for many years. So the all remote companies are, for instance, like GitLab or Zapier, or Automatic. They don't have any offices of their own. But even prior to the pandemic, they were organizing offsites. So they were meeting once a quarter in really nice locations such as Hawaii or Australia, and everyone would show up because it's such a fun place to go. And they were organizing the in-person time during those offsites. So, folks getting mentored, teams coming together, developing their own rituals. And I've been fascinated about these offsites for a while. And I feel this is a model that even the companies that have offices can learn from. I think just to state my thesis, I feel we need to be in person, but we don't probably, every team does not need to be there in person every week. And also, the office in a downtown location is not the only place we can be in person. So I think there can be a lot of imagination around when to meet, how frequently to meet, and where to meet. And that motivated me to study the offsite at Zapier, one of the all remote companies, to see how effective was the offsite in bringing people together after the offsite.
And was the thesis around studying the offsite around social connection between employees? Was it around collaboration or something else? Like, what was the hypothesis on the role the offsite played for the organization?
Yeah, so it was about studying how patterns of communication changed before and after the offsite. So there's been some recent academic research saying that the all remote model leads to more siloed communication. And so the thesis that we've had is, and this was, of course, during the pandemic, those researchers studied Microsoft and found that when Microsoft was completely remote and no one was meeting anyone, then the communication was getting more siloed. And so what I was studying in this topic with some co-authors was how the offsite changed communication patterns. After people left, did they stay in touch on Slack and other online forms of communication?
And how do you think about, and maybe you don't have to compare an organization like Microsoft and Zapier in this regard, right? But I imagine it probably looks and feels different for an organization rather that's always been fully remote in the role that an offsite plays versus an organization that at one point was much more office centric or full time in office, and the impact of splitting up, if you will, or spreading apart fully remote. Do you think those are different, or and the application is or the implications for offsites are the same, or is this really specifically around what does an offsite do for a fully remote company?
No, so the study was about that last sentence you said. It's about how the offsite changes communication at this all remote company. But I feel the implications are broadly generalizable to like lots of companies, because what I've been advocating and thinking about is even if you are meeting in an office in a hybrid model, you can meet in the office with an offsite mindset. So I think the GitLabs and the Zapiers of the world are on the cutting edge of developing management practices that make hybrid really effective. And I feel all the traditional companies that are transitioning to hybrid can learn a lot about how they manage that in person time. So, and how that whole day is scheduled, or how the whole week is scheduled. For instance, no one is sitting in a corner working on spreadsheets during that time. That's completely, counterproductive, right? So, it's all about group activities. It's all about team activities. It's all about things that we need to do in person. And I feel there's a lot that large companies can learn from these all remote startups.
That makes a lot of sense. So how did you set up the study? Did you use some kind of analysis of communication patterns pre, offsite, and post, or how did you approach the research itself?
Correct. So we did exactly that. So we had access to their Slack data, so we know who's talking to whom on Slack, at what frequency, and what they're even sharing. And of course, we signed all the NDA agreements, and everything is we don't disclose any personal information in the study. All of that is protected. And then we study how people meeting in the offsite changes communication patterns.
Got it. And what did you find? How important is it?
So there are two main findings, and let me state both. And I'm super excited about the second finding. So what we find, the first finding is that, or actually three main findings. So we find that if Rob and Raj met at the offsite, they are more likely to communicate on Slack after the offsite, even though they may have never communicated before the offsite. But then we looked at who does that communication, like where is the effect stronger. And interestingly, the second finding was we found that communication tended to happen between people who are demographically similar. So that was a big sort of aha, that even when we go to an offsite, it appears that we look for people just like us. And I would extend that to hypothesize that the same thing happens in an office. That when we go to the office on those office days, we tend to communicate with folks who are similar to us. Now, the question then becomes, how do you break that pattern? How do you make people who are not similar demographically communicate at an offsite? And what we found, interestingly, here was that if people are meeting in small groups, then they tend to talk to someone who's not like them. And the way we measured that was to see who traveled in the same cab from the airport to the offsite.
Fascinating.
Because the cab rides were organized based on flight schedules. So who you traveled in the cab was completely random. And we found that if Raj and Rob traveled in the cab together and spent like a quality 35 minutes together, even though they were dissimilar, they tended to communicate on Slack after the offsite. So I think, I'm not advocating that we organize randomized cab rides, but I think the implication of this result is that, be an offsite or be in the office, we need small, structured group interactions between dissimilar people. It could be a nugget, or, a small water cooler session where we bring small groups of dissimilar people who will then open up and connect with each other.
So it sounds like, and I think that's just fascinating. It sounds like it's not just about getting together in person, but the way that companies approach the structure of that offsite and even who gets together with who is actually pretty impactful in the kind of medium, longer term social ties and collaboration ties that come out of that experience. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. And I would extend that to say that the prior evidence is that also the same thing happens in offices. So there's research going back to the 1970s by Tom Allen, who showed that the in-office serendipitous communication is restricted to 25 meters of where we are based, which means that, you are talking to the same 8 people every day. So sales is talking to sales, junior people are speaking to junior people. So it is a homophily effect that we observe in the office or in the offsite. And to break that homophily effect, we need to structure something pretty intentionally in a small group such that dissimilar people connect.
That also makes me think, and this is a little bit off topic from what we're talking about specific to the study, but hot desking, I feel like has a very mixed feedback from employees, right? I think everybody in their ideal world would rather be able to go to the same seat and kind of be able to do that on a regular basis. But it sounds like in the spirit of the research that you've done, that more random grouping or less organized, consistent grouping may actually pay off with some social dividends and relationship dividends and mixing people up versus if you do go into an office and you sit within 25 meters of the same people, kind of like day in, day out, week in, week out.
Yeah, no, I think so. But whether desking is a solution, I'm not sure. We need more research because conceivably you can be sitting in a hot desk with in a hot desk arrangement with speakers on and never ever talk to the person next to you. So I think it's about the cab ride does something really nice. It forces people to talk to each other. It's rude not to talk to the person next to you. And we were talking about this in our research team. We said one advantage in the cab ride is you're sitting side by side, so you don't have to look at the face of the other person to talk. And we wondered like if that has an implication. If people were just made to sit side by side versus facing each other, would the probability of opening up with a stranger be more or less? So I think there's a lot of interesting ideas folks need to study and do more research on. But this is just, I think, the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Was there a half-life that you found, so to speak, in terms of how long the dividend of that offsite paid off in terms of increased communication or relationship building offline or sorry, online, like on Slack, for example, that took place after the fact?
So, to the best of my knowledge, and I'll go back to the data to double check that, I don't think we saw a decay. But of course, then we can keep collecting data to study this. And but I think you're raising a really good question, Rob, because it also has implications for how frequently these offsites need to be. So I think, and I don't have a great answer for that.
Got it. Yeah, I think that was the core of what I was trying to get at. Is okay. Well, if you do one every 3 months or every 6 months, like when do you start to lose some of the benefit of that connectivity? I guess the other half of it would also be how fast you're hiring and how quickly the team is changing, because that also might have a pretty big impact on how frequently those types of relationships would need to, in some ways, get rebuilt or kind of formed from scratch.
Absolutely, totally agree.
So, do you feel like coming out of the research, there's enough clarity on the finding that you can advise a fully remote company on what an offsite should look like? Is there a length of time or is there a type of activities, that you would almost, if we have a lot of people who listen who are fully remote. And so if they're saying, okay, we need to get together, what do you advise that time actually looks like in practice?
So just this one study, and that's why I keep thinking and saying that we need way more research on this. And I hope some of my academic colleagues take up that and we keep cranking out new research. So at least this study, I would be comfortable making two sort of implication statements. I feel the offsites are very effective in making people who are similar, demographically similar, connect on Slack and sort of like share a virtual connection after the offsite. That's a very strong effect. And then if the intention of these all remote companies is to make people who are demographically dissimilar also to connect, then it has to be done in the small group setting, which forces people to open up.
It's interesting. So in a way, and tell me if this is a correct interpretation of what you're saying, the more diverse the organization, in some ways, the more important these types of events or activities are, to actually be able to create relationships and amongst folks that maybe it sounds like naturally wouldn't gravitate or gravitate less often in your data, it sounds like, versus when they kind of are thrown into that opportunity to spend time together.
That is absolutely correct. And it's a great point because one of the advantages, or probably the most important advantage of work from anywhere for the organization is that you are able to hire talent more globally. And as a corollary, you're going to get more diverse talent. So I think while that is a great advantage, and that's why I've been so excited about this model for years, you of course need to make these people connect with each other. And it seems like the way to do that is in small group settings where people feel comfortable speaking to a stranger.
Do you think for companies, and I think about companies of different sizes, right? Like it's one thing to get my scoop is 25 people, right? So it's one thing to get all 25 of us together. If you're 500 people or 1,000 or 2,000 and fully remote, that looks quite different, especially if you're very global. Do you think, based on the research, that it's important to be able to get that large of a group together for a few days in the same place, or can regional offsites kind of like play that role? And should you try and mix up the regions? Like, how does this play out, I guess, at greater scale in terms of how you would suggest people get together to form a broader and deeper set of relationships?
Yeah, no, it's a great question again, and one on which we'll need research, and I'll not pretend to know the answer for that one too. But I feel anecdotally, what I've seen is that these all remote companies do these company-wide offsites once a quarter, but then teams would meet more frequently, maybe once every 2 months, uh, in a smaller group, in a location that's sort of like closer to it where people live. So the sales team would meet once every 2 months, and then folks will go to the offsite once a quarter or twice a year. And I feel that's a model which I like a lot, even for the companies which are more traditional, because even when you're bringing people back to the office, the same underlying, why are you bringing people back to the office? So that they connect and they stay connected during the time they're not in office. So it's the exact same rationale. And I feel there's a lot of findings we can generalize from what happens within all remote to the more traditional companies that are practicing hybrid.
And is that frequency instinctively for you feel like probably the right frequency, like every 3 months to 6 months type of get together? I know you didn't, as you mentioned, you didn't really study the half-life for how long those benefits endure, but just based on the examples that you've seen in fully remote companies that you have relationships with, that feels like the right kind of cadence, so to speak.
The evidence I have from a different study, actually, we had an experiment with HR workers in a very traditional company. And in that organization, we randomized every day of the week for 9 weeks who was working in the office versus who was working remotely. And that study is also on my webpage. And in that study, what we find uh, is about 25% co-location time is optimal. And 25% co-location time is optimal for a whole range of outcomes, including communication. But I'm not going to pretend to say that 25% is the magic number for every organization and every team. But my advice usually to managers is that just the way we ran the experiment with one organization and a group of HR workers, managers can run their own experiment and figure out what is the sweet spot. Is it 25? Is it 40? Is it 10%? Is it 5%? And it's not very hard to do. Like, you can choose a window of 3 months and conduct your own experiment to find out what is the. So if you're a manager thinking about hybrid, my first recommendation would be look up our paper. The design of the experiment is well documented, and run your own experiment to find out for your team what is the right amount of co-location. Then the question becomes, if it's 40%, do you need to meet, or if it's 25%, do you need to meet one day every week? Or is it okay to meet one entire week every month? Or is it okay to meet for a longer period once every quarter? And that is also something I think every team and every manager can sort of like brainstorm and figure out ideas about. And then the final question is about the location, the venue of where to meet. Do we have to go to a downtown office? Can we meet somewhere else? Do we meet on the West Coast, East Coast, somewhere else? So I think the frequency, the amount of co-location, the frequency of co-location, and the venue of co-location needs to be scientifically determined for every team.
There's a couple of things you said that are really interesting about that to me. One is, it seems like there is this continuum, if you will, where in theory, a company that is 5 days a week in the office, it sounds like it's probably not optimal for a couple of reasons based on what you described in terms of your research on how much co-location is optimal, at least in the study that you had done. But also, like at that point, in theory, the value of an offsite maybe would come down slightly relative to other organizations because they're already spending so much time together. But it almost feels like there's this scale where as you decrease the amount of time that you spend in an office together, maybe on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, the value of the offsite, so to speak, and getting people together for that more kind of like centralized fixed time seems to go up. And the other thing it makes me wonder is, I think some organizations are playing with how much do you spend on real estate right now, right? As you think about how much time people are spending in office. And it almost sounds like if you think about this real estate slash get together as a single budget, so to speak, and if you're spending less on the real estate as people are getting together, maybe less often in the office, and you're investing some of that in the offsites and being able to get together in more kind of like focused ways, it almost feels like there's a bit of a continuum there in terms of thinking about the optimal way to get folks together to build some of those relationships.
Yes, I'll just add to that. So I honestly feel that there is the distinction between offsites and offices is a very sort of it's work in progress, because ultimately it's about co-location. There'll be co-location time, in-person time, and there'll be work from anywhere time. And so I honestly feel that the offsite is just a form of, it's where they are meeting. They're calling it an offsite. But even the companies that are calling people for a couple of days in the office should study the offsite model and adopt the offsite mindset. There are a set of things that happen at these offsites which need to happen in the office. And then the distinction between office and offsite is frankly, it's irrelevant. Every company, if they adopt the offsite mindset, then I think that is the equilibrium that I predict companies should move towards.
Yeah. So if I understand correctly, it's really about how you think about the time that you spend together and what types of activities and who's spending time with who to make sure that you build those relationships and can create those connections, versus is it specifically in the office versus a different location in some ways.
Correct. So it's four things, just to summarize again. It's about what should be the fraction of in-person days. And that can be scientifically determined by running your own experiment. The second is, once you've determined what is the in-person versus not in-person split, how frequently should the in-person happen? Should it happen every week, every month, every quarter? The third question is, once you've determined the frequency, where should you meet as a team? Should you meet in downtown New York or in a nice resort in Florida? And honestly, I think that location should be determined based on travel budget. Looking at where the map of where people live and where would people be excited to go and travel. And the final thing, which I think should be common across all organizations, is what happens when we go to this in-person event. And there's a playbook of the all remote companies. And I've written about this in my GitLab case, that can be studied by every organization. So like I said, it's completely counterproductive to sit in a corner and work on code or work on a spreadsheet during this in-person time. No one should do that. It should all be about brainstorming and mentoring and team activities.
That's super clear. And I think a lot of folks will take away that as a very actionable set of things to do and advice. So I appreciate that. Is there any other kind of final takeaways or thoughts coming out of the research that we haven't touched on that are worth spending a minute on?
I think this is probably the most managerially relevant topic, because every company has some form of hybrid going, but just anecdotally, I've observed really nice hybrid being organized by the GitLabs and the Zapiers, and really terrible hybrid being organized by some other organizations that was
remain nameless.
Yeah, correct. Because if you and I are on the same team, Rob, and I show up on a Monday and Tuesday, and you show up on a Thursday and Friday, then we are never going to meet each other. So what's the point of me going and driving into an office, right? So I feel every manager at this point in time needs to really think about, this whole question of what is the right form of hybrid. And what I did in my previous response was just laid out a framework to think about that.
I love that. Raj, that's so helpful and a really, really interesting study. If you don't mind, one thing that we do before we wrap up every time is I always ask a few rapid fire questions just so people can get to know you as a person a little bit better. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right. So Raj, what was your very first job?
So my first job was with IBM in India many, many years back.
Okay. What were you doing at IBM then?
I was a software engineer just for a year.
Got it. Okay. What is the best book you've read lately?
Lately. So what I just finished reading was Amitav Ghosh's Smoke and Ashes, and I loved that book.
And what is that about?
It's about how the whole wealth of Western nations was built on trading opium, which was cultivated in India and sold to China.
Fascinating. What show or movie, if you're a show or movie person, are you obsessed with right now?
Right. I travel a lot, so I watched this movie called The Storied Life of, I forget the name of the person, but it was about this bookshop owner in New England, and I loved that movie.
Okay, I have to check that out. I haven't seen that. When you do go into an office, what's your favorite snack?
It's probably coffee. I'm trying to cut down on the snack part of it.
You and me both. I think I would answer that the same way. Who is, and I know this is going to be hard, but who is one future of work thinker that you really respect?
No, I respect Nick Bloom a lot. I think he's doing a lot of good work for many years, and he's become a great friend and colleague, and I respect Nick's work.
Yeah, his work is fantastic. And then one last question for anybody who is listening who wants to read more about your studies or learn more about you, where would you send them?
So my Harvard Business School webpage has all of my papers and all of my Harvard Business Review articles. That would be a great place to start.
Okay, great. Raj, thanks again. So informative and a lot of actionable stuff that people can take away on how to think about managing their teams and their time together better. So thank you so much for doing that.
No, thank you, Rob, for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more FlexIndex content, including past episodes, our FlexIndex newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.